Today marks another special 50th anniversary. It was the day President and Mrs. Nixon celebrated the return of the Apollo 11 astronauts 3 weeks after they returned from their historic mission to the moon. It took place 50 years up the road off the 10 freeway in Century City at the Century Plaza Hotel. President Nixon presented Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor for an American citizen. Vice President Spiro Agnew read the citations. Neil Armstrong's read in particular, as a member of the crew of the United States spacecraft Apollo 11, he participated directly in a unique and profoundly important adventure. The accumulated scientific knowledge and technological ability of mankind made man's first step on the moon practicable. The courage and skill of men like Neil Armstrong made it possible. His contribution to this great undertaking will be remembered so long as men wonder and dream and search for truth on this planet and among the stars. Neil Armstrong's life has been chronicled by journalists and historians, but none have done it so brilliantly, lucidly, and comprehensively as James Hansen. His essential biography is First Man, The Life of Neil A. Armstrong. It's not only a New York Times bestseller, but its adaptation to motion picture is an Academy Award winner. James Hansen is a former historian with NASA and author of 11 books on aerospace, and he's currently professor emeritus at Auburn University. Of Hansen's writing, Apollo 13 astronaut James Lovell says that he expertly combines the saga of Armstrong with the historical background of America's introduction to the age of space, an excellent book. First Man is available for purchase in the museum store, and Dr. Hansen will be available to sign it for all of you after this program. It's my pleasure to introduce to the Nixon Library stage, James Hansen.
Well, it's quite an evening for me. I hope you will enjoy my presentation to you. It's been a busy couple of years for me with the adaptation of the book into the film, and then, of course, more importantly, the anniversary of Apollo 11. And I was actually in Scotland. I'm going to say a few things about Scotland in a minute or two, but it might seem a strange place to go for the 20th of July, which was the anniversary of the landing date, but there's a small town in southern Scotland by the name of Langham, and Langham is the ancestral home of the Armstrong clan. And Neil, in fact, his ancestry has been traced back to that area, and Neil in 1972 visited Langham with his wife at the time, Janet. And so the little town of Langham wanted to celebrate the anniversary, and they were kind and generous enough to have me come to Scotland, and so that was a wonderful. But to be here is very, very special, and I have entitled my presentation to Snapshots from an Epic Life Story. It's really an epic American life story in so many respects, and I think it really would have been epic. You know, it's kind of hard to take the moon landing away from Neil Armstrong, and I certainly don't intend to do that, but Neil had such a tremendous career in life that even if he had not been the first with Buzz to land on the moon, and he the first to step out onto the lunar surface, he would still have been a very historically significant character, especially in his years as a test pilot. And so I want to present to you a view of his entire life, as my book itself does. And remember, the man was only an astronaut really for 8 years and only flew 2 times into space. They were quite memorable missions with Gemini 8, which was the first docking in space of 2 spacecraft, and then Apollo 11, which is kind of hard to beat. But he led a full life, and he himself grew a little bit concerned in the wake of Apollo 11 in the years after that people were only remembering him for his space achievement, and he much preferred to be remembered for the totality of his contributions, which were many in technical fields. First and foremost, Neil was an engineer. I do want to pay my high respects to President Richard Nixon for the role that he played in the Apollo landing. Of course, we know him. We know the telephone conversation that he made, calling it the most historic telephone call ever made, which certainly was the case when he called to Neil and Buzz when they were during their EVA on the Sea of Tranquility. Also, he was there for the splashdown on July 24th. He was out in the Central Pacific. He and a few of his advisors, including Henry Kissinger, were actually on their way on a round-the-world tour. They were going to stop in Southeast Asia. In fact, he went to Vietnam, he went to Saigon during the war, becoming the first president to actually visit a combat area since 1943, when Franklin Roosevelt met with Stalin and Winston Churchill in Casablanca in North Africa. But he very much wanted to be part of that historic landing, and there he is watching for the splashdown of Apollo 11 into the Pacific Ocean. And then, of course, here, as part of the exhibit, hopefully you've seen this. You can actually go inside and be Neil or Buzz or Mike. And they were in this mobile quarantine facility for a period of time after the landing, and President Nixon was there to greet them, and they had a good time talking to one another and greeting them on board the USS Hornet, which was their first destination after they were picked up out of the ocean. And then, as Jonathan mentioned, they had an event after they got out of quarantine. This was at Century City Plaza. It was a major black tie affair, and it was at the end of a very long day. They had started the day actually in Houston, and they went to New York City for a ticker tape parade. They went to Chicago for another major parade, and then the whole entourage flew on to Los Angeles for this black tie affair. So it is the 50th anniversary of that particular event, and it was for the astronauts and their wives kind of the start of well, it really would become a very whirlwind set of events, because in the coming weeks they would make an around-the-world tour, stopping at a number of world capitals to visit with people. Millions of people would meet them. I'm not sure any Americans have been greeted with such sincere enthusiasm and love since 1969 than those Apollo 11 astronauts. And there they were, coming back at the end of their world tour. They returned to the White House, and there is a picture of the Apollo 11 crew with President Nixon at the White House. And I guess I think it's fair to say, President Nixon was the president when the Apollo mission objectives were achieved, but the first landing. Of course, it was President Kennedy who had defeated President Nixon, or what became President Nixon in the 1960 election. And so it's kind of ironic in a way that it would be Richard Nixon who would be the president when the objective that mandate that President Kennedy had laid out in May of 1961 was fully realized. And so, it's just an irony. I think President Nixon handled himself and handled the achievement, and I love the way that in this presidential library, how there is recognition of President Kennedy's commitment to the Apollo objective. But back to my story. It's really, again, snapshots of his life. And I'm not sure you can read everything that's up here, so I'll read a bit of it to you. I do want to talk a little bit about Neil's background and the family background going back to Scotland. And there are some quotes here that I think are meaningful. They're meaningful to me and explain why I took the care that I did to go back through the Armstrong family history to see where he came from. Every man is a quotation from all of his ancestors. That was from Ralph Waldo Emerson. If you don't know your history, you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it's part of a tree. We are links between the ages, containing past and present expectations, sacred memories, and future promise. And the ancient Chinese proverb, to forget one's ancestors is to be a brook without a source, a tree without a root. And so I took the time, and I think Neil, of course, Neil was still living. He died in 2012. The book originally came out in 2005. And I started my interviews with Neil, and I ended up having 55 hours of tape-recorded interview with him over many months. And he knew, I started my questions to him dealing with his family background and what he knew about it. And he knew some things, and he knew that there were other family members who knew more, and he directed me to them. So I want to just quickly give you as much background of the history as we know of the family. It's kind of interesting that when you trace the legacy, the genealogy of First Man, that you trace him back to Adam Armstrong, who was born in 1638. He's the earliest known relative that we have. and he married a woman named Jane Graham, and they had 2 sons. And this was again, in the region, well, I'm going to point it out to you. It's, if you know any of your English history or Scottish history, there was an area that was considered to be kind of, well, it was kind of a no man's land. It was called the Borders. And it was an area where the Scottish kings nor the English kings really exerted very firm control. So the families, the clans, actually were the ones that really controlled this area of the border. And the Armstrongs were one of the leading families, one of the leading clans in this area, and they were known as the Border Reaver. They were one of the Border Reavers. And the word reaver means a robber or a raider or a bandit. And so and Neil realized that the history of his family sort of went back and had this kind of darker, colorful kind of side to it. That these were people that during the summertime would farm, but during the wintertime they would pillage and steal cattle and things like that. And it turns out that that the Armstrongs, they were one of the strongest clans in this area, and the Nixons were one of the other ones. The Nixons were border reavers also. And so I'm not sure if any of the Nixon genealogists have gone into this or not, but and I'll show you in just a second, there was a marriage between an Armstrong and a Nixon that, again, I'm not sure if this connects to Richard Nixon's family line or not. This is Neil going to Langham in March of 1972. This is the town that I went to just a few weeks ago. You can see him up at the top of the Gilnockie Tower, Johnny Armstrong of Gilnockie. This was kind of the fortress tower for the Armstrong clan, and it is the home today. If you go to southern Scotland, it's just south of Carlisle, England. If you go to Langham, you should visit the tower. It's the home of the Armstrong Clan Association, so the history of the clan is kept there. And there's Neil again, a closer up picture of him at the top of the tower. And there's me to the right. We reconstructed the picture. They've done a little bit of work on the tower. They put up a guardrail, which was good for me because heights aren't great for me. But so I went up there, and then they have, here are some of the actors that play border reavers today if you go to the Gilnockie Tower. And so I'm there with one of the border reavers. I'm not sure if it's a Nixon or an Armstrong or an Elliott or whatever, but it's a very colorful history that both of these families have. And I just wanted to go on. This we trace him back to Adam, and then his son Adam Armstrong II. We know this is a direct line, and he married a Mary Forster, and they had 4 children. And they stayed in this border region of England and Scotland into the 18th century. And then the Armstrongs, immigrate to America. And in the mid-1730s, Adam Abraham Armstrong crossed the Atlantic with his wife, Margaret Nixon. Again, I don't know if this connects to the Nixon lineage or not, but he marries a Nixon. And the father goes with them, and they are early settlers into Pennsylvania. They settle in Greene County, Pennsylvania. So they're very early American, before the American Revolution. John Armstrong is the eldest son of Adam Abraham Armstrong, who died in 1779. And John, we know, surveyed the mouth of the Muddy Creek, 160 miles to the west of Greene County, and settled some 60 miles south of Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh. And he married a Mary Kennedy, and they raised 9 children. So these are, it seems appropriate that Neil Armstrong comes from this really a pioneering American family that had emigrated from the Scottish-English borders. And then John Armstrong and his wife Rebecca Miller, along with John's brother Thomas Armstrong and his wife Alice Crawford and an infant, they travel by flatboat down Muddy Creek to Pittsburgh and then steer themselves into the Ohio River, and they go some 250 miles down to Hockingport, which is just west of modern-day Parkersburg, West Virginia. So we have all this, the family, we've all documented this, and we're confident this is Neil's background. And these 2 Armstrong couples settle in Ohio. The one family, Thomas and his wife, settle in Athens. And John and Rebecca go farther west and settle near Fort Greenville in far western Ohio, really kind of out into the frontier area, and they raise 8 children, building a farm of some substance, of some 150 acres in the early 19th century. And then we have a David Armstrong. He's the eldest son of John II and Rebecca Miller. And we know about that they had a son, Stephen, out of wedlock, and they end up being Neil's paternal great-grandparents. When Margaret dies in 1831, her parents, Jacobus van Nuys and Rachel Howe, they take over the raising of 7-year-old Stephen, which again had been born out of wedlock. And Stephen receives an inheritance. He marries a widow, a woman who had been married before. And with widow Badgley, Stephen has his son Willis, and they create a prosperous 400-acre farm, with Stephen dying in 1884. Now, I'm going through this very quickly because I do want to cover it. And then you have Willis Armstrong, who's the only son of Stephen and Martha Watkins Badgley, widow Badgley. And it turns out that this Willis has a tough life. His eldest daughter dies in a fall from a horse. Lillian dies in childbirth. Willis remarries in 1905. He marries a woman, Laura Koenig. They live in this home in St. Mary's, Ohio. And then Willis and Laura have 2 children of their own, Mary Barbara and Stephen Koenig Armstrong, born in 1907. Stephen is Neil's father. And so there's Neil's father, Stephen. He was a Koenig. He comes from, from this line that I've laid out for you. He has half-sisters because of this earlier marriage and half-brothers. And as a boy, Stephen's father suffered economic misfortune from some very bad investments. Stephen himself escaped from a house fire at age 6, which is interesting because Neil's own family in Houston in the 1960s will have a house fire, and his 2 sons barely make it. And so Stephen graduates from high school in 1925, and in 1929 he marries Viola Engel, who is the daughter of a line of, that lineage has been traced too. They trace back to a town in western Germany, near the Dutch border. But Viola, who had been born in 1907, to a mother whose last name was Katter and a father whose name was Engel. Her father dies when she's very, very young, and Carolyn remarries to a man named Korspeter, another German, and they reside on a farm in rural Auglaize County outside the town of Wapakoneta in northwestern Ohio. And on August 5th, 1930, Neil Armstrong is born in this farmhouse at the Korspeter farm. It was a tough birth. The mother, at one point the doctor went to, actually Stephen was off working in another county. He was a tax auditor for the state of Ohio. He wasn't home when the birth happened, but Viola's mother was there, and the doctor at one point asked the mother, well, should we save the child or should we save the mother? It was that dicey of a situation. Fortunately, they were able to save both, and the baby was born healthy, and there's young Neil. You can't find a kid that's much cuter or more all-American in terms of what kind of life he had as a boy than young Neil Armstrong. I love writing about Neil as a boy. He lived in a series of small towns in Ohio. As I said, his father was an auditor in the state, and so the state would assign him to audit the books of one county. It usually took about a year to do the county. Most of it was farmland, as a lot of Ohio is. Stephen had grown up on a farm, and he was kind of an expert on the tax assessment of farm equipment and farm property. So he would be given this county to do the auditing for, and the family would move there, and then when that was done, they would move somewhere else. So I think Neil, by the time he was 8 or 9 years old, had lived in 6 or 7 different rural counties of Ohio. One thing that I believe strongly, and this was part of my approach in the biography, is I do believe in from the Wordsworth poem, that the child is the father to the man. And you really can't understand, and I think it's true for all of us, you can't understand who we are, who an individual is, unless you understand the childhood. And so I spent a lot of time understanding Neil's childhood, his parents, his communities that he lived in, his siblings, his friends. If you ask what made Neil, I mean, there's lots of things that are involved, but if you ignore his childhood, you're going to miss a lot of what's really formative about him. So I spent a lot of time looking into that. And then this is another premise that I think is very strong, especially in Neil's case. Men are what their mothers made them. Now this I'm a father, and I don't especially like aspects of that quotation, because fathers can be awfully important too, but Neil was especially close to his mother. Of course, Neil was the firstborn. There would be two later children for Stephen and Viola. But Neil was certainly, as firstborn, I mean, Neil could do no wrong in his mother's eyes. The relationship between Neil and his mother was extremely close. The relationship with his father was a little bit not so close. Partly it was because the father was off working these jobs, and there were some odd things that needed to be explained or at least introduced in the book. For example, if you look at letters that Neil wrote back home when he was in college, he went to Purdue University. The letters he wrote home were introduced, "Dear Mother and Family." Dad was left off. And he did the same thing when he was in Korea. He would fly combat in Korea, "Dear Mother and Family." If my children wrote letters home that said, "Dear Mother and Family," I would not be happy. Where's Father in this? And so there is something there, and the book does go into that to some extent. The closeness that he has with his mother, I don't think it's there with his father, although in some ways he's going to turn out a little bit like his father. There he is with his siblings, with his younger sister June and his brother Dean. And I think June was probably my most important interview, other than Neil himself. I tell you guys, if you don't want your full biography written, don't let the biographer talk to your sister, because the sister's got all the dope on you. She knows, and June did. I mean, Neil was the type of guy he was so focused, and from the time he was a boy, as you'll see in some quick snapshots here in a minute, he was so focused on his love of airplanes and building model airplanes and eventually learning how to fly. He was a Boy Scout. He was, for things that he liked, subjects that really interested him, he went to them 110%. Things that he didn't really care, that weren't so interesting to him, and unfortunately that often meant things going on inside the family. He didn't pay much attention to it. So when it came to the dynamics of the family relationships, I really had to rely on June. And June was terrific. June really, she understood her brother, I think, better than either Neil's two wives would come to understand him. She really understood him. And I think June told me their nicknames were Neil the Peel, Dean the Bean, and June the Prune. That's what they called each other. But they were quite a threesome. Neil had his first flight when he was 5 years old. His father took him. They were in Warren, Ohio, which is kind of up in the northeastern part of the state. And his father, they were giving rides. And on Sunday morning, there was a discounted fare for passengers to go up and take a ride in the trimotor. And they were supposed to go to church. Mrs. Armstrong was very, very religious. She was an evangelical Christian, and she wanted the family to be very much the same. Stephen wasn't really so religious, and one of the things he did was he skipped out on church that Sunday and took Neil to the airport so they could go up. I think it was maybe for 25 cents or something, they got a ride up in the airplane. So that was Neil's first time in an airplane. And as I said, he quickly became totally passionate about airplanes. Of course, they were living near Cleveland, and the national air races, were in Cleveland during that era, and Neil was aware of that as a boy. I think he was actually taken to the air races at least on one occasion, and he started to build model airplanes, begging his mother for a 20-center and moving up to a 50-center, and he always did odd jobs. He cut grass, he did everything. He ended up working in a bakery, as a boy. And almost all of his money would be spent on airplanes, on model airplanes. And eventually, as he got into his teens, it was even starting to think about taking flying lessons. So he was so passionate about airplanes. He wanted to go to college to become an aircraft designer. That was his goal, to become an aircraft designer. And the family, was a modestly, the father had a nice living. Mother didn't work, she worked at home. And to go to college back then, Neil needed to have some sort of scholarship. So he applied to a special naval program after the Second World War called the Holloway Plan. And he was fortunate to get one of the scholarships. And so he went to Purdue University to study aeronautical engineering, and it was fairly close, It was, in fact, one charming thing about it is, he skipped the second grade because when he moved to this new town and they did the testing to see where he belonged, his reading skill was so high they skipped him a grade. So he didn't go to the second grade; he went right to the third. So he was always younger than his classmates, and I think he started college when he had just turned 17. His birthday was August the 5th, and so he had just turned 17, and he had his pilot's license already. He got his pilot's license on his 16th birthday, the very first day he could have it. He soloed and got his license. He didn't even care about learning how to drive an automobile. He didn't care about that. It was all about getting the license to drive an airplane. So he got this scholarship to go to Purdue on a Navy scholarship. And there he is in 1950. This is my favorite picture of him. He looks like he's 13. He's really 19 at the time. He'll turn 20 during that year. But this is after he made his first carrier landing in the Gulf of Mexico. The naval aviators go to Pensacola and go through the full training. So he goes to Purdue for 2 years, and then he's called to naval training because what's happened in 1950? The Korean War has broken out. And so he needs to get to Pensacola, get training, which he does, becomes a naval aviator, gets assigned to a jet squadron. Jet airplanes are coming along, and he's actually becomes a member of a fighter squadron that is one of the very first all-jet fighter units in the United States Navy, and goes to Korea. Well, when he comes back from Korea, where he flies 78 combat missions, he comes back, he finishes his degree at Purdue. He has an aeronautical engineering degree, and he gets a job with the United States government. NASA hasn't been created yet, but there is a federal agency called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, known by the initials. And it was the agency responsible for the progress of the American airplane. And so Neil gets a job working as a test pilot for the NACA, originally in Cleveland. He ends up eventually out here at Edwards at the Flight Research Center. But at Purdue, he had met Janet Sharon, who becomes his wife. And it's a really interesting relationship. I have had 16 hours of interview with Janet for the book back in the early 2000s. Unfortunately, Janet passed away just, 8 or 9 months ago. But my interview time with her was really, really important because she becomes a crucial figure, not just in his life, but as a lot of the American wives of American astronauts, they become public figures themselves. But it was real interesting for me to ask Janet about Neil and their dating and their relationship. I said to Janet, "Tell me about dating. What was it like?" And she said, "Well, we didn't date." And I said, "Well, you got married." And she said, "Well, he came back from Purdue. He was older than I dated a lot when I was in college. Neil had hardly dated at all. We were kind of in the same group of friends. I lived in a suburb of Chicago, and when Neil got back, he had to do reserve Navy flying out of the Great Naval Air Station at Great Lakes up north of Chicago. He offered me some rides, back home. And then one day I'm up in Wisconsin at a summer camp where I'm helping to teach kids to swim and so forth. And Neil stops by and tells me that he's got this government job and he wants me to marry him. They'd never dated. They really didn't know each other. And I said, "Well, why did you marry him?" And she said, "Well, he had a government job. He had a salary. He was handsome. He was more mature than most of the boys I had met. And he asked me." And so they got married, these two people that really didn't know each other very well. And one, they end up staying together for 38 years, but it is a very interesting and somewhat problematic relationship. It just is. and the book does cover that. 56, so Neil comes out to California, and he becomes a test pilot. He actually comes out here because, as I said, he started in Cleveland, but Scott Crossfield, who was the first pilot to fly Mach 2, Scott was an NACA research pilot, and he left his job with the NACA to become the chief test pilot for North American aviation out here, flying the X-15 program, which was a North American aircraft along with the Air Force and NACA originally, later NASA. And so when Crossfield leaves the Flight Research Center, which becomes Dryden, becomes now Armstrong, that spot is open. And so Neil applies, and he gets transferred from Cleveland out here to California. So that's why he gets out here. So he's here in 56, and he starts to fly all sorts of airplanes, 50 different aircraft types, 2,400 hours of flying time, 900 of it in jets. I mean, as I said, if the man had not become an astronaut in 1962 and had just stayed in his test piloting role, he would have been historically significant for just what he did as a test pilot, because he was an engineer in the cockpit. You know, he was one of those guys with the real right stuff, someone who was not just trying to break records, but trying to learn what the man-machine relationship was, what it was, moving from the transonic to the supersonic to the hypersonic speed regimes, moving to systems like the X-15 rocket-powered plane, where it's not just stick and rudder stuff, it's a new type of system altogether that you have to learn how to operate. And so Neil was perfect for that. He was a intellectual, really intellectual type pilot / engineer, the real right stuff. So that's what he's doing in the late 50s. He ends up flying the X-15 7 times, once well over 200,000 feet, right to the very edge of space. And during the time that they're in California, of course, they're starting a family, and they have their first child, Janet and Neil do. They have their son Rick, who's born in 1958. And I think Rick was out here at one point at the library for the opening of the exhibit. And then Neil and Janet had a second child, a little girl named Karen, who Neil just totally fell in love with. Not that he didn't love his son, but Sister June tells me that the little girl Neil just went head over heels in love with this little girl. He called her Muffy, which was short for Muffin. And the sad and tragic thing about that was that at age 2.5, Karen she had learned how to walk, but she started to stumble and her eyes started to cross. And it turned out that she had a glioma of the pons, which is a really malignant brain tumor. And they tried to save her. They tried cobalt radiation, which was really harsh on a little 2-year-old girl, to the point where she had learned to walk, but she couldn't walk anymore after the radiation. They stopped the radiation, and just took her home, and she died in January of 1962. She died on the wedding anniversary of Neil and Janet, and they never celebrated that day again in their married life. In the aftermath of Karen's death, Neil decides, and Janet is very supportive of this, maybe a fresh start would be the thing to do. And Neil sees a call from NASA for a second class of astronauts. Of course, we've had the Mercury 7, the original Mercury astronauts, and the Mercury flights. But now we've had President Kennedy's commitment to the lunar landing. There's a new class of astronauts. They need astronauts with more engineering background. Neil decides, after some delay, that he's going to go ahead and apply for that astronaut selection. And he is selected in September 1962. Some space historians believe that this class of astronauts might be the most talented group ever. I mean, it was quite a group. It included people like Jim McDivitt and Jim Lovell and Ed White and Frank Borman and Pete Conrad and John Young. It was a heck of a group of astronauts who were going to do some incredible missions, both for the Gemini and the Apollo, and even into the space shuttle program. So Neil goes into training, and so my book covers, what the Gemini astronauts had to do. He was he was a very good astronaut. He was, again, very, very focused. It was, of course, a very time-consuming job, 6.5 days a week, everybody that was in training. It affected all of the families in very significant ways. The wives were, often just sort of pretty much on their own to raise the children. It was tough on the families. There's a picture of Neil's family. There would be another child born in 1964. A second son, Mark, was born. So this is the family picture in 1966 with Rick and Mark, Janet and Neil. This is a few months before Neil makes his first flight into space, which is Gemini 8, which is that mission I mentioned to you that does the first docking in space. And if you've seen the movie or you know some of your history, you know that this was a successful docking, but almost immediately after the docking, the combined spacecraft, the Gemini 8 and the Agena, which was an unmanned spacecraft with which the Gemini 8 docked, went into a tumble. They thought it was a problem with the Agena because the Agena had been giving NASA some problems earlier, and they figured if there was some kind of problem, you should undock from the Agena because that would be the problem. Well, it turned out that wasn't the Agena. It was a thruster stuck open on the Gemini spacecraft, so when they undocked, the spinning got even worse, and to the point where they were merely spinning about 1 revolution per second, and they were close. They were probably within 35 seconds of blacking out, which if they hadn't figured out how to stop the spinning from happening, we would have had 2 dead astronauts in Earth orbit, and that could have been a real showstopper at that point in time. But there was a way. Neil and Dave Scott figured out that if you turn on the reentry control system, the thrusters that you need and the fuel that you need to get your back down through the Earth's atmosphere in the proper way, that if you did that, you could get that spinning to stop. You would counteract that. But if you turn that system on, the mission rule was you had to come home as quickly as possible. So they did that. They saved themselves. They saved the spacecraft. But the mission control in Houston told them, you got to come down. So instead of landing in the Gulf of, not in the Gulf of Mexico, but in the Caribbean area, they had to land near Okinawa in the Pacific. So NASA had to make some quick changes in the plans for what Navy ship was going to be picking them up. So Neil was very depressed after Gemini 8 because there had been a lot of things planned. Dave Scott was going to be making a 90-minute EVA, which he didn't get to do. And so Neil came back, and as he told me, he was really depressed afterwards. And there were some people, even within the astronaut corps, that were second-guessing the crew, that somehow, if I'd been in there, I'd been able to figure out a way to do that without, turning on the RCS system. Well, that was not really, that's just kind of the Monday morning quarterbacking that you sometimes got even among the astronaut corps. But Neil, most people, and certainly in retrospect, looking at it, thought Neil did a tremendous job, as well as Dave, to get themselves out of that predicament, and so he moved on, and it wasn't going to hurt his position in the crew assignments from that point on. Neil, this is a vehicle that Neil would fly along with other members of the Apollo crews to learn how to do lunar landings. The problem was, how do you simulate a lunar landing in the Earth's atmosphere when the gravity conditions are very, very different on Earth and in the Moon's environment? And so at Edwards, at the Flight Research Center, starting in the early 60s, engineers started to work out, a design of a contraption that got the nickname the flying bedstead, a way to figuring out of a machine that could kind of fly the way it would fly in the lunar environment. And I put this slide up the way that I do, because usually you just mention Neil flew this thing several times, and in fact he almost dies in it in May of 1968. I'll show you that picture in just a second. But the critical point is Neil was part of the engineering team at the Flight Research Center who conceptualized the very vehicle that was needed to research how lunar landings would be done. So it wasn't that he was just, in a way that made him another really logical and good choice to be the commander of Apollo 11, because he not only had practiced in the lunar landing training vehicle, he'd been part of the team who had actually conceptualized the very vehicle that would be there for the training. There he was in May 1968. It was a very risky machine to fly, especially in windy conditions. And Neil said, I said, how close of a call was this, Neil? And he said, it is about as close as I had. Probably within a fraction of a second, he was able to eject before the thing blew up and crashed. Well, I'm moving through some history pretty quickly, but Apollo 11, Collins, Aldrin, Commander Neil Armstrong. This is the anniversary that we've been celebrating. This is one of my favorite pictures. I think this sort of sums up the relationship between Neil and Buzz. There's a lot to say about the two of them. I admire Buzz immensely, but they were they were both engineers and they were both astronauts, but they were very different people. I have a lot about the relationship between Neil and Buzz in the book. There's a lot of interesting issues to explore about who was first out and who, what was there controversy there? Was Buzz happy not being first out? And why didn't Buzz take any pictures of Neil on the lunar surface? Because, all the pictures. This is the launch of Apollo 11. This is them getting into the spacecraft, the Saturn V going up. Apollo was all about leaving. That was Mike Collins. What was Apollo about? Well, you're leaving the planet for the first time. And for Neil, Apollo was all about landing. Apollo 10 had gotten all the way to the moon. They had done lunar orbiting. They had detached the lunar module and had flown it down, quite a distance, but they didn't land. And what was left for Apollo 11 to do was land, and that was what Neil was mostly focused on. So, yeah, that's Buzz coming down the ladder. Neil took that picture. That's Buzz's footprint. That's not Neil's. There was no picture of Neil's footprint. That's Buzz at the flag. Buzz told me that he was going to take a picture of Neil at the flag, but the very second that was going to happen, they were going to switch cameras, and he was going to take Neil's picture. He heard in his earpiece that President Nixon had made the phone call. Well, Buzz didn't know that President Nixon was going to call, and he started to think, well, what am I going to say on this phone call? And he forgot all about taking the picture of Neil. Well, Buzz kind of doesn't understand how careful historians can be in looking at the documents. And if you look at the transcripts, the communication transcripts, second by second that exist, and you look at when exactly did they first hear that President Nixon was making the phone call? Well, it comes, the time at the flag was over by a few minutes, and the two astronauts were several feet apart. So what Buzz is remembering can't be right, because the chance to take a picture of Neil has come and gone by the time of the phone call. So I don't know if Buzz is just something Buzz came up with years ago and now just remembers it as something that really was true. I don't know. But he didn't take a picture of Neil at the flag. Of course, this is Buzz too. If you look in the visor, you can see really about the only picture of Neil on the lunar surface. Neil taking a picture of Buzz, and his reflection is in the faceplate. So there you have Neil. That's about the best we've got. That's Neil. But Buzz was supposed to take a panorama of the lunarscape, and it just so happened Neil got in the way in the panorama. So Neil is in this panorama, and there are a couple other pictures that Buzz took where you can see part of Neil's backpack and part of a leg, but no explicit picture of Neil. And when I asked Buzz about it, I was real honest about it, and Buzz said, well, it wasn't in the mission plan for me to take. And I said, so all the pictures you took were in the mission plan? He said, oh, there were a few that weren't in the mission plan. They just weren't taken of Neil. Now, he did take this one. This is back in the lunar module after the EVA is over. And it's a real nice picture of Neil. And so I asked Neil in one of our interviews, I said, Neil, why didn't Buzz take pictures of you on the lunar surface? And he said, well, Buzz was just more photogenic than me, Typical Armstrong. Typical, modest, witty Neil Armstrong. This is them coming back up in the ascent module to join back up with Columbia, Eagle joining up with Columbia, and Mike in the command module. The splashdown, Here they are in that mobile quarantine facility, about ready to talk to, or are talking to President Nixon. Neil has, when he gets to Houston, they're in a lunar receiving laboratory. They have to stay in quarantine a couple weeks because everybody's afraid of, because a book came out, I think a movie too at the time, called Andromeda Strain, and there were suggestions that, that lunar infection could, wipe out the Earth's population perhaps. And so they had to quarantine him. They eventually stopped doing that after a couple of flights, and there wasn't any problem. But Neil had his 39th birthday while in the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, so this was the staff of the LRL and his birthday party in Houston in the LRL. This is the day post-Apollo. This is the day I told you about earlier, where Neil goes to, and the crew goes to New York, Chicago, and then out to Los Angeles. Neil makes a trip that within a few months after the Apollo 11 crew makes the Around the World tour, he goes on a USO tour with Bob Hope, and he's quite funny. There's a DVD collection of Bob Hope's USO tours, which I bought, and the ones with Neil. Neil had some real good one-liners that got big laughs from the Marines and the other troops that were there. So Neil, I want to sort of end it with some thoughts about Neil in terms of his afterlife, because his becoming first man on the moon was, he was an after celebrity. He wasn't interested in that, and it became quite a burden for him. Even going back to his hometown, there was a big parade for him in Wapakoneta, and he agreed to do that. But things just got tough for him because so much was asked of him. Here he was in 1970. He went to the Soviet Union. The Soviets actually honored Neil. They acknowledged that the moon landing had happened, and they had him give an address to the Academy of Sciences. And here he is with some of the Soviet officers and cosmonauts. And I think this is either Gagarin's widow or it could be Tereshkova, the first woman in space. I should know that, but I'm not sure. Neil doesn't get a chance to fly again. They're not going to risk him losing him as an astronaut. So NASA asks him in 1970 to take over as an associate administrator for aeronautics within NASA. And of course, airplanes had been his passion, and he was okay with doing that, although it meant a desk job in Washington, which wasn't really his style. But they wouldn't leave him alone. I mean, they wouldn't let him do his job. Instead of leaving him alone, letting him really be the associate administrator for aeronautics, they kept calling him to show up at this embassy or this congressman's office. They want a picture taken with some VIPs. And Neil got fed up with that really quickly and decided, well, I'm leaving NASA, I'm leaving Washington. And what did he do? He went back to Ohio. He took a teaching job at the University of Cincinnati, teaching aerospace engineering. But even there, if you really, my book covers this, even there, they wouldn't leave him alone, at least at first. I mean, the first day of class, there's a bunch of reporters that are outside in the hallway waiting for his class to end, and he has to try to help his students, find a way to get down the hallway and out of the way of the press, and Neil sort of locks himself in the room. Even as a professor at the University of Cincinnati, he was still getting hundreds and hundreds of letters from fans that he felt that he needed to respond to, and the university gave him some assistance in answering those letters, but it was like never ending. There he is back in Langham. One point that I would want to make here in wrapping up is that Neil did a lot of things. He didn't become a recluse. I think journalists who could not get him to agree to do interviews, and he would do very few interviews over the rest of his life. Journalists would then sort of conclude, well, he's reclusive. We don't know what his address is. He won't answer his phone. He won't do an interview. He must be leading the life of a recluse. Well, Neil did a lot of things, and he hardly lived the life of a recluse. And if you follow what all he did from 1969 to his death in 2012, which I have done, you can appreciate that. He went on, this was one event he did in 1973. He went on a cruise with his family, with some other prominent scientists and astronauts and authors to watch a total eclipse of the sun from the best place you could watch it, which was off the coast of Africa. And while on the cruise, he gave lectures on the ship, as did some of the other people, like Isaac Asimov, that was also on the cruise ship. He stayed passionate about airplanes for his entire life. I mean, if you wanted to talk to Neil, if he were here tonight, and it'd be so great if he were, you could talk to him. He would talk to you about airplanes as long as you wanted to. If you asked him about Apollo and the moon landing, you probably wouldn't get very much. It was something that sort of exhausted him, because that was all. Well, I mean, you think about it. If you had a chance to talk to Neil Armstrong, you're going to ask him about the moon landing, aren't you? I mean, you're only going to have a few minutes, and you're going to ask him. But for him, that's all he ever seemed to get asked about, and he much preferred talking about other things. He went on some expeditions. He went to South America in 1976 to an interesting set of caves, and so he did do some interesting things like that. Of course, he won all kinds of awards. There were many that he turned down, that he didn't accept, but he did accept a number of things. And then in '79, he accepted his first commercial endorsement. He was very careful about putting his name on any kind of product, and he was convinced that Chrysler an American car company, was going through some hard times, and the president at the time, a man named Lee Iacocca, convinced Neil to do some commercial spots, and so Neil did that. And in 1980, this brought some interesting criticism. He actually hosted a show on PBS on the voyages of Charles Darwin, and I have looked through all of his correspondence at Purdue, where his papers are at, and there were people who didn't like the fact that he seemed to be endorsing the theory of evolution, so he got some criticism from people about that. And I'll just show you a couple more. This is kind of maybe where I'll stop, just to sort of show you how far things would go. I mean, the mythologies about Armstrong are manifold. There's many of them, and so many things have been written or said about him which just are not true. And I actually give a number of talks that are just basically myth-busting Neil Armstrong. This one's kind of one of the more interesting ones. What you're seeing here is a facsimile of a letter from the State Department in 1983 regarding Neil's alleged conversion to Islam. There was a story that was circulating not long after the moon landing that Neil had heard the Muslim call to prayer while he was on the lunar surface, didn't know what it was, heard it again after he came back to Earth, converted to Islam, and moved to Lebanon. Well, he did move to Lebanon. It's a little town north of Cincinnati. That's where he moved. But he kept getting all these invitations to come to mosques and do talks about his conversion. And he finally got a hold of the State Department and said, this isn't true, and is there anything we can do to stop this story from spreading? So the State Department sent a circular to various embassies trying to explain this, and Neil did a teleconference with journalists in Cairo, Egypt, where he answered all their questions. And it really just hasn't mattered. I mean, I talk about this at length in the book as well. And if you Google today, Neil Armstrong plus Islam, you'll get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of hits. It's a story that just won't go away. I'm always reluctant to tell the story because it seems like, I'm not picking on Islam by doing this, because the fact of the matter is, Apollo 11 was such an epochal moment in human history. Human species for the first time has stepped off onto another world, that really all of the world religions wanted to be part and have done what they can to be part of the story. I mean, you could look at Christian sermons that were done on the Sunday of the moon landing, and the astronauts were made into messianic figures. And so it's not just Islam, it's Christianity, it's Hinduism, it's Buddhism. They have all wanted to sort of project their meanings onto space exploration and onto the astronauts and onto the space program. This one just happened to be the one that was, I think, the hardest one for Neil to shake, and so that's why I mention it. And I'm going to stop right there. Honestly, he did do some interviews. He wasn't, again, the recluse that that people made him out to be. He continued to do things. I think when he married Carol, his second wife, in 1994, she brought him out of his shell. And I think Neil was a lot more open in the last 18 years of his life in his second marriage than he was with the first. And I think he enjoyed his life and was very active. They toured the world together. And it was tragic when Neil died in August of 2012 following quadruple bypass heart surgery. And there were some complications that occurred after that, and we lost him at age 82. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. I came to not just admire and respect him, but I really came to love the guy. He had one compliment for me, and only one compliment for me when the book was finished. He said to me, "Jim, you wrote exactly the book you told me you were going to write." Now, that doesn't sound like much of a compliment, but coming from Neil Armstrong, it was like the biggest compliment you could get, because so many people had told him one thing and tried to get him to do another, had tried to manipulate him into positions, and that, Neil hated that. Neil, if you did that to Neil, you can forget about it. And so the fact that he said I wrote exactly the book that I told him I was going to write, nothing could make me prouder. Nothing makes me prouder to this day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. First Man is available for purchase at the museum store, and Dr. Hansen will autograph copies for you. I'd like to ask the first question. Could you tell us a little bit about how this book got adapted to film?
Oh, boy. I was just down at an event in Tucson, Arizona called Space Fest. My friend Francis, where's Francis at? Francis, you stand up. Here's one of the most prominent space historians and writers alive today, Francis French. Great friend of mine, brilliant writer and storyteller. We were down in Tucson, and I gave a talk entitled First Movie, an innocent author's journey from book to movie to Hollywood film. There's so much for me to say. All I can say is that there was interest from Hollywood in making this into a film even before I got a good start on the book, because people knew that Neil had never agreed to have any author write his life story, so that itself made news. Initially, it was going to be Clint Eastwood and Warner Brothers, and that didn't work out for some reason that is private to Clint and Warner Brothers, I guess. I never really heard. Universal Studios picked it up, and then when the young director Damien Chazelle came along and knew that Universal shared my book with him, and he saw some things in the book that captured his interest and thought could make a movie that would be different than what the space movies we've had, that would be more personal, tell this personal story. And so Damien took that, and that, it took a few years, and I was pretty heavily involved. I reviewed all the scripts, but I guess I'll just sort of sum up my participation by saying when the screenwriter, Josh Singer, sent me the preliminary outline for the screenplay, and Josh had just come off winning the Oscar for the screenplay he wrote for Spotlight, the movie Spotlight that some of you had seen. So an Oscar-winning writer sends me his preliminary outline. I send him back 75 single-space pages of comments. He wouldn't talk to me for like 3 months. And I got a call from one of the producers in Los Angeles saying, "What are you thinking, Professor Hansen?" Well, I thought they wanted to know what I thought about it, So, but it was a mistake. I mean, Josh was hard at work trying to come up with something that would, be the vision that Damien Chazelle had for the film, and I was thinking, something else, I suppose. But I continued to give them more than they wanted. I mean, I continued to give them everything I had, and I told them, take it or leave it. I didn't have power to control what they were doing. And Josh told me in the end, he said, "Jim, you had a good batting average. Your batting average was about 350. And if that would win me the batting title in major leagues, 350s, that's good. Now, whether that's good for an author who's having his book adapted to a Hollywood film, 350, that means you're getting a hit once every 3 times, roughly. I'm not sure if that's good enough or not, but anyway.
We have a question right here.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Welcome to Orange County, sir. In your chapter 5-49, the first line of it says that if Neil Armstrong had not become a naval aviator, he would not have become the first man to walk on the moon.
Interesting.
And as most people who have ever met him or spoke to him or know him like you do, he was more proud about landing on the moon, not walking on the moon, because anybody could
Absolutely.
walk.
Absolutely.
But one of the interesting things about Neil Armstrong was he was one of the few naval aviators who had not earned naval astronaut wings as a result of his time in the space program, because he went as a civilian. He'd already left the Navy. But then some years later, a later part of his life, aboard
right.
USS Theodore Roosevelt, they honorarily award him naval astronaut aviator wings. Any thoughts on how that happened and what the Navy wings meant to him?
Yeah, thank you very much for adding that. And that's all true, as I know it. And I guess one thing that's kind of maybe surprising that you didn't know, that 6 of the 7 commanders that had been assigned to command Apollo landings, 6 of 7 were naval aviators. And I talk about this in the book. And I remember I got a couple letters from Air Force pilots who weren't really very happy with me. But the reality was, I mean, you had to face the facts, 6 or 7. And the guy who put the crews together wasn't a naval aviator, so it wasn't like service, favoritism. Deke Slayton was an Air Force guy, and he was putting the crews together. And I was just speculating. I'm not sure if this was a factor or not. But what is unique about being a naval aviator in your training? Well, one really central thing is you got to land on a carrier. You take off and land on a carrier. And so I speculate, is there something about the experience of landing on carriers? And, your mission's not over till you get back safely on your carrier, and that can be the most dangerous part of your mission sometimes. Is there something that connects between that flying experience and landing on the surface of the moon? And so I speculate and talk about that in the book, because it's just it's a fact. 6 of the 7 commanders were naval aviators. Maybe it was something about the way naval officers were trained differently. I don't know, but it's again, some Air Force pilots weren't too happy about that.
We have a question right here.
Enjoyed your talk. As a former Alabama employee to an Auburn employee,
War Eagle?
Roll Tide.
Oh, okay. Oh, you're one of those. Okay.
But a theme that I caught from your talk was the idea of frontiers.
Yeah.
From the
Absolutely.
family on the Scottish borderlands to colonial Pennsylvania with his famous ancestor, John Armstrong.
Absolutely.
To Neil being a test pilot to being on the lunar surface. From your talks with Neil, did he have a sense of what he was doing was breaking down frontiers, conquering frontiers, or even carrying on the family tradition of conquering a frontier?
Well, I don't think he thought about the family tradition that much, honestly. But I think he did think about his work as an engineer in terms of working on a frontier of knowledge. And in terms of how he got to be an astronaut, again, he was born in all 3 of the Apollo 11 astronauts, by the way, were born in 1930. So it's like, if you wanted to be on the first moon landing, you needed to be born in 1930. It just happened to be, at a time where Neil, as an engineer, as an aeronautical engineer, the technology of flight is moving from propellers to jets to rockets. The speed regimes are moving from subsonic to transonic to supersonic to hypersonic. And Neil just happens to be, those are the frontiers of flight that are taking place technologically and scientifically. And it just so happens that Neil is perfectly situated in terms of his generation, his time of life in history. He's perfectly situated time-wise to be one of the people to take advantage of that. And I think he very much appreciated that. And I think I've heard Mike Collins say the same sort of thing in particular, how fortunate they were to be people that were alive and of age at just the right moment in time. But yeah, I think he did have this appreciation of working on the frontier, but I think he always connected it to his engineering work and how engineering itself it's taking knowledge and doing something with it, and that's moving the frontier along, not just understanding that there's a new frontier, but actually doing something about it.
We have a question right here.
I'll start off by saying I'm a retired Air Force officer,
I'm
but,
sorry.
but I'm the son of a naval aviator. So
There
I
you
totally-
go.
I
You
totally
got it
get
both covered.
During the some of the news coverage over the past month or so,
Yeah.
there were accounts of some artifacts that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took to the moon. A couple of pieces of the Wright Flyer.
Yeah.
I think I also heard that they took medals that had been posthumously awarded to Soviet astronauts
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
had died during their space program. Any interesting stories about things that Neil Armstrong shared with you that they took?
Well, I mean, the exhibit here in the library has a nice little spot where they're talking about what was left on the lunar surface. You know, one of the interesting things is they left a silicon chip that had micrographically inscribed goodwill messages from over 70 world leaders. And that was very much in the same spirit as the plaque on the landing legs of the lunar module, where it said, "We came in peace from all mankind," which was a sentiment that President Nixon himself, personally approved of. And they did. They left commemoration medallions commemorating the deaths of cosmonauts Komarov and Gagarin, and so that was done as well. And there were things that each took privately. They all had what's called a personal property kit, or PPK. And so, they could take pieces of jewelry, class rings. Neil brought his fraternity pin and his. We really don't know everything Neil took, because the astronaut office had them all fill out a manifest of what they were taking with them in their PPKs. But Neil's manifest has never been seen, as far as I know. I asked him to see it myself, and he said, "Oh, it's in one of my boxes. I'll try to find it for you." And it never got found. I'm hoping that it's in one of the boxes. All of his stuff has been, well, there are things that the sons have, but most of his stuff, which was in his house, has been sent to Purdue, especially his documents. So I'm hoping that there are some things. Maybe in a box. There are a couple boxes at Purdue that have instructions not to open them until a certain number of years have passed. And I'm hoping that maybe the manifest will show up at some time, and so we'll know completely what Neil took to the lunar surface, because we don't know for sure. It's kind of speculative. We know some things that he did take, because he told us he took them, but we don't have a complete listing. So,
We have a question right here.
Did you have an opportunity to speak with him about fear? Specifically, was he more fearful with his combat missions in Korea, or was he more fearful or anxious about landing on the moon?
Yeah, I'm thinking about my friend Francis French here, because I know he's talked to the astronauts about similar things. They don't really express much about being fearful. They really don't. Neil, when I talked to him about combat, he would say to me that the fact that you were flying into combat made the flying that much more intense, that it was almost like it made the flying even more interesting and more challenging, and like it wasn't fear, it was like their training is going to kick in, and their performance abilities are going to be tested. And so it doesn't seem, I think there had to be certain elements of fear that had to come in, but they were such a focused group, I think mentally different than maybe a lot of us. And although there's one thing about Neil that I talked to him about that is a little interesting in terms of how to interpret it. Neil's heart rate, if you look at his heart rate as an X-15 pilot and as an astronaut, his heart rate at certain moments was much higher than the heart rates of his peers. I think during the lunar descent to the landing, his heart rate got very high. And if you compare it to, say, John Young's heart rate or what Buzz's heart rate, it was much, much lower. And so I asked Neil, I said, because to us, I think the common, brain would think, well, heart rates must suggest anxiety, right? It must mean that you're getting anxious and maybe getting a little fearful. Neil rejected that. Neil said that what it was that if you look at when his heart rates were peaking, it was when his body and mind was anticipating a higher level of performance that he was going to have to achieve. And so it was, in a sense, his body and mind preparing to do what it needed to do. And that's when his heart rate would peak. I'd have to have a medical person look at the data and do the correlations to see if that, but that's how he understood it. He didn't understand it as any greater anxiety or fear on his part. It was just his way of meeting the challenge. So,
We have a question right here.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much. I got the impression in reading your book that Buzz Aldrin really made an effort to be named the first man to actually step on the moon. Can you tell me the background behind how Neil Armstrong was ultimately the one to do that?
yeah. Well, there's a whole chapter called First Out, and there is some variation of historical interpretation about this. In reading the literature and reading astronaut interviews and talking to astronauts, I mean, it seems clear that Buzz did some lobbying on his own behalf, going into some of the other astronauts' offices and suggesting that maybe he would be a better person than Neil. Neil was so reserved, and this was going to be a role where somebody who could speak out for the program was going to be important. Buzz told me when I asked him about it, he said, I really wasn't concerned about being the first. I just wanted a decision made because I was getting a lot of questions, especially his father was a very tough father. Buzz graduated number 3 in his class at West Point, and all his father could ask was who's first and second. He had a really tough dad. And Buzz told me, he just needed NASA to announce who was going to do it because people were bugging him about it, and he needed a decision on this. I don't really buy Buzz's argument, honestly, and there's some reasons why. It's not just my own intuition. I mean, I found a document from 1972. Buzz, this is 3 years after Apollo 11. Buzz goes to a man named George Low, who was one of the real important people in the Office of Manned Spaceflight, and he goes to George, and it's a specific meeting, and this is a memorandum from George Low. And the memorandum says, Buzz Aldrin has come to my office, and his purpose for being here is he asked me how the decision was made that Armstrong went off, was the first one onto the lunar surface, and not him. And then it goes on and explains his answer. But my question, in my mind was, if Buzz really wasn't concerned about being first onto the lunar surface, what's he doing 3 years later, going to George Low's office to ask that question? That just suggests something very different, very different to me. Why Neil was first, that can be a long story. But I will say, Chris Kraft wrote and told a story that was not in any other way in the historical record. He said that there was a private conversation between Chris Kraft, Bob Gilruth, who was the director of Johnson Space Center, what became Johnson Space Center, George Low, and Deke Slayton, the head of the astronaut office. And the conversation was about Buzz and Neil, who was going to be off onto the lunar surface first, and not looking at it in the near term, but looking at it in the long range. Because they knew, the conversation went, whoever's going to do this is going to be the next Charles Lindbergh. And we know what Lindbergh went through. And we need a man who's going to be like Lindbergh, who's going to be modest, who has no ego, who's going to be able to handle himself in every situation. And the 4 men together said, Neil, it's got to be Neil. We're not going to put Buzz into that role. And Chris Kraft in a documentary, Kraft died, 3 weeks ago, something like that? Kraft says in an interview for the Armstrong documentary that was done and just out this summer, Kraft recalls this incident. And then he says, was I responsible for putting Neil on the moon first? Yes, I was, he said. And then he said, it wasn't that I disliked Buzz. And then he sort of pauses and he says, well, I didn't like him either. So, I mean, I believe that evidence, when you triangulate it all, and sometimes historians have to do that, you've got the evidence, it's coming from different directions, you've got to sort of put it in the melting pot, see what to come up with. I think Buzz really wanted to be the first man onto the surface of the moon. I don't believe that he purposefully did not take any pictures of Neil, But I think something was going on subconsciously where Buzz Aldrin was not thinking about the appropriateness of taking pictures of the commander when he was on the lunar surface. Mike Collins, in fact, said to me in my interview with him years ago, he said, it's not that Buzz doesn't know the difference between right and wrong, he just doesn't always know appropriate from inappropriate. And I think that's what happened. He wasn't thinking about, I should take a picture of Neil. Well, he thought about it for a second at that flag, apparently, but at least that's what he has told us after the fact. That's probably, is there another question? Or?
Yes, right here.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. That was extraordinary, fantastic. It was said or written recently that, you kind of made mention of it, that he had turned down multiple attempts at somebody to write a biography on him, and that he selected you to be his biographer. And it was said that, or written that, it was because something that you had written that compelled him to choose you. What was it exactly that you had written that so?
Well, you're asking a really challenging question and one I've been asked many times. And my first and probably most important response is, once he said okay, I wasn't about to say, well, why did you give me the okay? I think it was a number of factors. I was about 20 years into my career at that point, and I had written other books that dealt with, I'm not an engineer. I wasn't trained. I never took a single engineering course. But my first books all were about engineers and engineering organizations and engineering culture and how engineers solve problems. And Neil, first and foremost, saw himself as he was an engineer. And so he could look at my previous books and realize that I was the type of person who wouldn't be sensationalizing his life. He grew up in northwestern Ohio. I grew up in northeastern Indiana in Fort Wayne, about 50 miles from Wapakoneta. We had kind of the same Midwestern accent. He in fact said to me once, I grew up in Ohio, went to school at Purdue. I grew up in Indiana, went to Ohio State, and we both came from farming families. And I think one thing that happened was when he invited me to his home in suburban Cincinnati for our first face-to-face meeting, this was before he agreed, and we had an afternoon of conversation, and it went really, really well. But I think there was one specific thing that was said. I'd done some books that dealt with NASA Langley Research Center history. NASA Langley's in Virginia, and it dates back to World War I. And I said to him that one of the people that I'd really learned a lot from was a man named Jack Reeder, who was a test pilot for the NACA and then for NASA. And that Jack had taught me a lot about what test pilots really did. And as soon as I mentioned Jack Reeder, Neil's wife, Carol, she comes in and out of the room, and she was sitting there. Neil turned to Carol and said, Jack Reeder was the best test pilot I ever knew. And then he turns back to me and says, and I have to say this, that's what he said, and he turns back to me and says, and Chuck Yeager was the worst. That's the only bad thing about anybody I ever heard Neil say. And I'm telling you this story not for the second part, I'm telling you for the first part, because somehow, some way, by accident, the one person I mentioned to Neil as being significant for me in terms of understanding what test pilots are all about is I picked somebody that he says is the best test pilot that he's ever known. I think I had it clinched right there, honestly. I mean, consider this. What if I would have said to him, what do you think of Chuck Yeager? I think he's the greatest test pilot that ever lived. I wouldn't be standing here right now if I had said that. But somehow I had picked the guy, that he thought was the best. And this is a guy, Jack Reeder. I mean, who's heard of Jack Reeder? I mean, you have to really be deep in the belly of aviation history to know who Jack Reeder is. But Neil knew who he was, and that I think. I mean, as soon as when I drove back to the hotel that night, I was grinning from ear to ear. Not that he still hadn't agreed. We had months to go before I got an agreement from him, but I thought, boy, that's a good thing that I mentioned Jack Reeder's name, And I think so. In a nutshell, I think it was that, and and the fact that the fact my reference to Jack Reeder came out of the background in aerospace history that I had.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. Please, God, give Dr. Hansen a round of applause.